It started with a sound that didn't belong in the middle of a peaceful Sunday morning, an explosion of metal on carbon fiber, followed by the kind of silence that only happens when every appliance in your home suddenly dies at once. Lights off. Coffee machine mid-brew and sputtering. My home office screens black. And then, the groan of the windmill outside stalling like a wounded beast. When I ran out the front door barefoot, coffee still in hand, I thought maybe lightning had struck. Instead, I found something far more absurd. A burning drone lodged deep in the middle of a $30,000 wind turbine blade, the remains of its rotor twitching like a dying bug. And next to it, marching up the hill with the nerve of someone who just popped a kid's balloon at a birthday party, came Karen, president of the HOA, wearing her signature sun hat and an expression so smug it could have been patented. She pointed at the wreckage like it was my fault and said, "Well, maybe next time you'll think twice before installing an eyesore in the middle of our community." I stared at her, then at the blade, then at the wrecked drone, then back at her, and I realized Karen was about to learn just how expensive community drama could get. A few days before the crash, life was calm, at least by HOA standards. I'd just finished tuning the final firmware update on my windmill. The whole thing was custom-built, 35 feet tall with reinforced composite blades and a smart grid system that funneled power into my home, my EV charger, and the animal shelter on the south end of town. Technically, I owned the land right on the edge of HOA jurisdiction. I'd cleared it with the county, filed all the right environmental impact forms, and even won a state sustainability grant for the design. But Karen? Karen saw it as an affront to neighborhood aesthetics. Never mind that the windmill was on a hill barely visible from the street. Never mind that it powered half my block when the grid went down. To her it was distracting, non-compliant, and, her favorite insult, offensive to traditional values. I didn't know what that meant, but I was pretty sure wind energy hadn't offended anyone since the 1800s. She started with the classic Karen moves. Petty notices. Passive-aggressive flyers left on my porch. Claims that the whirring disrupted her meditation space, even though her house was 2 blocks away. When those didn't work, she got creative. She started flying her drone. Yes, the same one that would later become a $30,000 mistake, over my property, citing aerial survey rights. I caught it hovering outside my window once while I was brushing my teeth. Another time, it followed my dog across the yard. When I confronted her, she simply smiled and said, "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." But the day of the crash, her drone went too far. The footage from my home security cameras showed it clearly. The drone lifted off from Karen's backyard like it was on a military mission. It hovered, turned, and then sped straight toward the windmill. It didn't drift or falter. It wasn't an accident. It was a kamikaze run. And as it made contact, the sound was catastrophic. The blade cracked like a rifle shot, split down the middle, and the turbine groaned as its sensors shut everything down to prevent a full collapse. Smoke hissed from the base, and my solar battery system, wired to back up only in emergencies, struggled to keep my systems online. I had to manually disconnect the whole array. The windmill was down, and so was everything it powered. I didn't scream at Karen. I didn't call the cops. I didn't even throw the mangled drone back into her yard like I wanted to. I simply looked at her and said, "You owe me 30 grand. She scoffed. "You should have made it drone-proof." I asked her if her Tesla was deer-proof too. She didn't laugh. Instead, she doubled down. Said I was responsible for operating unsafe equipment, and that she'd be filing a formal HOA complaint. And she did. That very evening, a letter was taped to my front door by one of the HOA's clipboard-wielding enforcers. It accused me of violating neighborhood safety codes, failing to report an environmental hazard, and impeding aerial navigation in a residential zone. I laughed so hard I almost inhaled my dinner. Aerial navigation? This wasn't LaGuardia. It was a cul-de-sac with retired accountants and kids who still played with RC cars. But sure enough, Karen claimed her drone was part of a home security operation and had the backing of the HOA board. Well, at least the two other members who always voted with her. I knew what I had to do next. I grabbed the broken drone, snapped high-resolution photos of the damage, and sent everything to my lawyer. I also pulled surveillance footage from 4 angles, including the one that captured Karen holding the controller while grinning like she just egged the principal's car. I backed it all up on the cloud and sent a copy to the HOA board, minus Karen, of course. My attorney was already smiling when he called back. "You've got her," he said. "This isn't a dispute. This is sabotage." Still, part of me held out hope that Karen would realize what she'd done and back down. Maybe she'd offer to pay for part of the blade. Maybe admit the crash was her fault. Maybe even apologize. But Karen didn't do any of those things. Instead, she doubled the complaint. By Tuesday, I'd received 2 more notices. One citing visual pollution, the other claiming I needed to dismantle the windmill within 30 days or face community action. I drove to City Hall, slapped the signed zoning permits on the clerk's desk, and requested a public hearing. If Karen wanted a war, she was going to get it. But this time, the wind wasn't going to blow in her favor. And that's when the real games began. By the end of the week, she'd brought in a drone technician, her cousin Carl, who tried to say the windmill was interfering with wireless signals in the neighborhood. She was laying the groundwork for a full-on attack, and I had a feeling she wasn't done. But I wasn't backing down either. Because if there's one thing I learned from engineering school and years of dealing with passive-aggressive bureaucrats, it's this: the strongest structures aren't the ones that avoid the storm. They're the ones that are built to stand tall when it hit. And my windmill was just getting started. The morning after the crash, I woke up to the sound of a leaf blower, except it wasn't a leaf blower. It was Karen, standing at the edge of her driveway with a megaphone in one hand and a printed stack of community updates in the other. She was announcing a special emergency HOA meeting to address what she now referred to as the dangerous windmill incident. Her voice echoed down the street like a bad election rally. "We cannot allow hazardous technology to threaten our peaceful neighborhood," she bellowed. "This is about safety and aesthetics." I watched from my porch, still half asleep, clutching a mug of lukewarm coffee, wondering how someone could be that loud at 7:30 in the morning without caffeine or shame. Several neighbors peeked through their blinds. A few rolled their eyes. One flipped her off from behind a curtain. But Karen marched on like she was leading a crusade against the devil himself. By noon, I had 3 more complaint slips stuffed in my mailbox. One accused me of endangering local pets, another claimed that birds had stopped flying through the area due to unseen frequencies, and the third said that children had become anxious around spinning objects. That one actually made me laugh. Meanwhile, I was on the phone with my insurance company, who couldn't stop laughing either once I explained that the turbine blade was taken out by a rogue drone. "You're kidding, right?" the rep asked. "Like a military drone?" I said no, just an overpriced hobby model piloted by an HOA president with the emotional maturity of a damp sponge. They promised to escalate the claim to the adjuster and scheduled a technician to inspect the damage later that week. In the meantime, I began building my evidence folder. The footage of the crash had become my golden ticket. 4 separate angles, clear audio of the impact, and the high-definition zoom on Karen's smug face while holding the controller like she was defusing a bomb in an action movie. I forwarded all of it to my lawyer, Jake, who told me it wasn't just a civil case anymore. It bordered on criminal vandalism, especially with the financial damages involved. "You're sitting on an airtight case," he said. "But knowing HOA types, she'll throw every ridiculous claim in the book at you before she admits fault." And Jake was right. That evening, Karen dropped a new flyer on every doorstep, including mine. It was titled "A Community in Crisis," and featured a low-res image of my windmill blade midbreak, surrounded by red arrows and phrases like, "What's really going on here?" and "Unregistered surveillance tech?" But she didn't stop there. She filed a police report. I found out because a local officer came by my property to follow up on a potential complaint of reckless machinery. I walked him through everything: permits, safety protocols, even the footage. He watched the drone crash with wide eyes and muttered, "Yeah, this isn't on you." I'm not even sure why she thought this would go her way. Before he left, he told me they'd likely close the complaint unless Karen tried to escalate again. But I could tell from his tone he knew she probably would. The next twist came when the HOA officially summoned me to their emergency board meeting. Held in the neighborhood clubhouse, it felt more like a low-budget courtroom drama than a civil discussion. Karen sat at the center of the fold-out table with a giant manila folder in front of her. Two other board members, George and Denise, flanked her. George looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Denise just kept scribbling notes like she was prepping for a deposition. When I entered, Karen didn't even look at me. She tapped the microphone and began with, "We are gathered here today to address a serious threat to the harmony of our neighborhood." I wanted to laugh but kept my mouth shut. She laid out her version of events, which included the drone being on routine patrol for neighborhood watch purposes, the windmill having suddenly jerked into motion as if possessed, and a claim that I had programmed the turbine to activate during drone operations. The lies were laughable, but her delivery was Oscar-worthy. She even brought a printed diagram of windmill parts and tried to explain rotational intent sabotage, a phrase I was fairly certain she made up on the spot. When it was my turn, I played the footage. The room was dead silent as the drone zoomed straight into the blade and exploded in a puff of smoke. Karen shifted in her seat. George cleared his throat. Denise paused her furious scribbling. Then I showed the second clip, audio included, where Karen could clearly be heard saying, "Let's see how he likes this." Her voice, unmistakable. The mood shifted fast. George leaned back and asked Karen, "Did you really say that?" She stumbled over a response, claiming it was taken out of context, and she was referring to the noise levels. But the damage was done. Denise slowly turned her notepad around and began underlining words. I couldn't see what they were, but I guessed it wasn't in Karen's favor. Before the meeting adjourned, I handed out printouts of the zoning approvals, the turbine's environmental impact certificates, and a letter from the Energy Office verifying that my system was not only legal but officially approved for backup utility assistance. Karen didn't say a word. She just stared at the floor and drummed her fingers on the table. But as I left the room, I could hear her say quietly, "This isn't over." And I believed her. Because people like Karen don't back down when they're wrong. They double down. Sure enough, the next morning, there was a new flyer. This time with a warning. "Attention, Windmill Zone declared under investigation." It even had a made-up badge logo stamped on the corner. I looked closer. It was her cousin Carl's drone company logo with the words, Airspace Compliance Division, underneath. It was clear now, Karen wasn't just trying to smear me. She was trying to turn this into a full-blown takedown, with her family involved. Later that afternoon, Carl himself showed up with a tool belt and a drone testing kit, claiming he'd been contracted by the HOA to assess electromagnetic interference patterns. I told him he could assess nothing unless he had a warrant or city authorization. He smirked and said, "We'll see about that," before flying a drone 5 feet from my windmill and recording it like he was filming a documentary. I filmed him right back and sent everything to Jake, who nearly choked on his lunch when he saw the footage. "You've got your retaliation timeline," he said. "Let them keep pushing. They're handing us the lawsuit on a silver platter." The battle lines were drawn. Karen had brought in reinforcements, but I had the law, footage, permits, and physics on my side. The windmill might have lost a blade, but I wasn't about to let that be the end of this fight. Not when she thought she could bulldoze me with flyers, lies, and a cheap drone. What she didn't realize was that in trying to clip my windmill, she'd just clipped her own wings. And things were only going to get messier from here. By the time the weekend rolled around, Karen had officially lost her grip on subtlety. Her campaign against my windmill went from annoying to delusional. Early Saturday morning, I looked out my front window and saw a giant handmade banner staked into her yard. In wobbly red paint, it read, "Stop the spin, say no to dangerous tech." I blinked twice, rubbed my eyes, and confirmed that yes, she had actually turned this into a protest. As if the windmill was some villainous death ray looming over the neighborhood. But it didn't stop there. She began handing out printed pamphlets door to door titled, "The Truth About the Turbine," filled with conspiracy-level nonsense about microwave signals, radiation, and oral disruptions affecting her sleep. She even had a bullet point blaming the windmill for the sudden decline in her cat's appetite. At that point, I didn't know whether to laugh or file a restraining order. Later that afternoon, things escalated again when Carl returned. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought 2 guys in matching polo shirts with his drone company's logo embroidered over their chests and a pickup truck with Aero Integrity Airspace Solutions stenciled on the side. They claimed they were conducting compliance fieldwork and needed to run diagnostics on suspected electromagnetic anomalies. I stood at my gate and asked if they were affiliated with any government body. Carl said, "We're private sector consultants certified through industry associations." I asked which ones. He changed the subject. Then they tried to walk into my yard. I stopped them cold and said unless they had a warrant, court order, or official documentation from the city, they weren't allowed to step 1 inch onto my land. Carl scoffed and muttered something about how people with something to hide always talk about boundaries. I pulled out my phone, pressed record, and calmly said, "You're currently trespassing and being recorded. Leave now or the cops will escort you out." They didn't push their luck. Carl spat on the dirt, called my turbine a joke, and stormed off like a rejected villain in a B-movie. The entire thing felt surreal, like I was living in a low-budget HOA-themed soap opera. I sent the footage to Jake, who told me we were getting close to a slam-dunk civil suit. The attempted trespass, the coordinated harassment, the fake investigation, all of it was painting a perfect picture of malicious intent. Jake even began preparing a motion for punitive damages, citing Karen's behavior as an orchestrated defamation campaign. He advised me to install more cameras, back up all files, and avoid engaging Karen directly unless absolutely necessary. I took his advice seriously. I added 2 more surveillance cams facing the perimeter, synced everything to a secure cloud, and let my smart doorbell record every flyer or HOA enforcer that approached. The tipping point came the next day when I received an official-looking envelope with an embossed HOA logo. Inside was a notice claiming my windmill violated a new HOA bylaw passed at an emergency session, specifically one that now prohibited large-scale wind or solar energy structures exceeding 15 feet in height without prior community approval. This was a joke, considering my windmill had been installed over a year prior, with permits filed and approved by the county. I called City Hall the next morning and confirmed that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property's energy installations. The woman on the phone even laughed when I explained what Karen was trying to do. "She thinks she can override state clean energy laws with a neighborhood rule?" she said. "Good luck with that." But I wasn't going to leave it at that. I wanted to make sure Karen and her circus of drone weirdos felt the full weight of accountability. So I called in a favor from an old college friend who worked at the State Energy Commission. He was more than happy to help. 2 days later, a certified field inspector named Roxanne pulled up to my property in an official vehicle with a clipboard, safety vest, and all the legal documentation necessary to shut Karen's antics down. Roxanne spent 3 hours conducting a full inspection, measuring distances, cross-referencing permits, and recording windmill performance stat. When she was done, she turned to me and said, "You're not just in the clear. You're a model example of what more homeowners should be doing." Right on cue, Karen walked over, arms crossed and jaw clenched. She tried to introduce herself as the HOA president. Roxanne didn't even blink. She pulled out her ID and said, "Unless you're with the county or the state, this is not your jurisdiction." Karen tried to pivot into a rant about health hazards, claiming she developed nausea from the oscillations. Roxanne asked her for medical documentation. Karen had none. She accused me of bribing city officials. Roxanne calmly replied, "Ma'am, I work for the state." Karen tried to argue that the windmill created a hostile aesthetic environment. Roxanne laughed and said, "That's not a legal phrase." Karen finally stormed off, huffing something about calling the governor. That evening, Roxanne emailed me an official report certifying the legality, efficiency, and community benefit of the windmill. Jake added it to the case file, which by now had become thicker than a college textbook. But what none of us saw coming was Karen's next desperate move. The very next morning, she went door to door once again, but this time, not with flyers. She was collecting signatures for a petition to have my windmill declared a neighborhood nuisance. Her logic was flawed, but she was persuasive to anyone who hadn't been following the drama. She even told one neighbor that my turbine was harboring illegal surveillance equipment, and another that it was attracting hawks. Her lies were outrageous, but a few people bought them. She gathered just enough names to call for another HOA vote. This time, I decided to show up prepared. When the HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Friday evening, I brought a projector, speakers, and printed copies of Roxanne's report. I stood in front of the whole room, calmly played the footage of the drone crash, displayed my original permits, and walked everyone through the timeline, from the first flyer to the fake inspection to the state's full endorsement. Then I played a clip of Karen telling Carl, "Make sure this looks official so we can get him shut down." Her voice, her face, her intent, caught in crystal clear quality. When I was done, the room was dead silent. Even George looked stunned. Karen tried to object, but the HOA vice president cut her off and said, "You lied to us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Someone in the back said, "She's been wasting our time." Another added, "We should vote on removing her." Karen's face drained of color. She stood, opened her mouth to protest, and then, realizing the tide had fully turned, grabbed her purse and stormed out. No one stopped her. I walked home that night knowing the fight wasn't over yet, but the winds had shifted. Karen had thrown everything she had at me, from drones to fake bylaws to Cousin Carl. But now, the narrative was crumbling, and the consequences were starting to blow back in her face. All I had to do was stand firm, document the truth, and let her bury herself. Because if there's one thing more powerful than wind, it's karma. And it had just started picking up speed. After the HOA meeting imploded and Karen fled with her petition sheets crumpled in one hand and her pride in the other, I expected her to go quiet. But Karen was the type to treat retreat as a strategic pause. I didn't trust the silence. For 2 days, there were no flyers, no megaphone announcements, no sudden complaints. It was eerie, like the calm before a hurricane. I stayed alert, checking my cameras, scanning HOA messages, waiting for the next shoe to drop. It didn't take long. On the 3rd day, I got served papers. Karen had officially filed a small claims case against me for emotional distress, loss of property, and intentional interference with personal security equipment. Her claim? That I had aggressively weaponized my windmill to sabotage and destroy a vital HOA surveillance tool, and that I had maliciously embarrassed her in public. The ask? $5,000 for her drone, $5,000 for her trauma, and $2,000 for defamation. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the document, but beneath the humor I could feel the annoyance creeping in. She wasn't letting go. Despite the mountain of evidence against her, she still wanted to drag this into court and flip the script. I forwarded everything to Jake. He called back 10 minutes later, sounding like he'd just hit the jackpot. "This is better than we hoped," he said. "She's officially made it a legal matter. That means we countersue, and not just in small claims." He explained that since the damage to my windmill exceeded $30,000, and because we had documented harassment, attempted trespass, and public defamation, we could escalate to district court. And better yet, with the state inspector's report in hand, we had ironclad support from a regulatory body. Jake got to work immediately. Within 2 days, we filed a civil suit against Karen seeking the full cost of the blade replacement, lost income from energy output disruption, punitive damages for harassment, and reimbursement for legal fees. The paperwork alone probably weighed more than Karen's drone. A court date was set for the following month. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had once been neutral started stopping by to wish me luck. Some shared their own stories about Karen, how she fined a family for planting the wrong flowers, or banned solar garden lights because they were too whimsical. Turns out I wasn't the first to be targeted. I was just the first to fight back hard enough to make it stick. In the weeks leading up to the court date, Karen made a last-ditch attempt to save face. She went on a smear campaign, claiming I was a tech saboteur, a manipulator, and possibly a Russian spy. No, seriously. She told one neighbor I was collecting wind data for foreign entities. The poor woman came to my door asking if I worked for a defense contractor. I invited her in, showed her a spreadsheet of power output for the animal shelter, and offered her cookies. She left with a confused smile and a renewed dislike for Karen. Finally, the big day arrived. The courtroom was surprisingly full. A few HOA members came. Carl showed up in a poorly fitted suit, looking like a kid forced to attend a wedding. Karen sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table with a new lawyer, someone clearly not briefed on how ridiculous this whole case was about to become. Jake and I took our place. The judge, a stern but fair woman with the patience of a saint, called both cases to be heard together. First, Karen's complaint. Her lawyer fumbled through a series of bizarre claims, most based on emotional distress and perceived slander. They submitted pictures of the broken drone, a screenshot of my security footage, which, ironically, only made her look guiltier, and even one of her holding her cat, which apparently had developed anxiety. Then came our turn. Jake presented the footage. 4 angles. Karen with the controller. Her voice saying, "Let's see how he likes this." The moment of impact. The technical breakdown of the blade failure. The repair estimate from the turbine manufacturer. The official report from the state energy inspector. And finally, the timeline of harassment, complete with flyers, fake bylaws, attempted trespass by Carl, and recordings of Karen's claims to neighbors. The judge leaned back and took it all in, asking only a few sharp questions to clarify details. Karen's face turned from red to pale to paper white as it all unraveled. After a brief recess, the judge returned with her decision. Karen's claims were dismissed outright, with a warning that any further harassment could result in a restraining order. Then came the ruling on our case. The judge ruled in my favor on all counts. Karen was ordered to pay $30,000 for the replacement blade, another $5,000 for the interim power losses, and $10,000 in punitive damages. On top of that, she had to cover all legal fees, which totaled over $7,000 more. Jake just nodded like he'd seen it coming. I sat there stunned, trying not to let the grin split my face in two. Karen sat frozen, as if someone had pulled the batteries out of her soul. Carl slumped in his chair and whispered something about leaving town. I stood up, thanked the judge, and walked out of that courtroom with the kind of satisfaction that doesn't come around often. Outside, a few neighbors clapped. Someone whistled. I don't know who. I didn't care. I had won. Not just the money or the verdict, but the principle. Karen had tried to break something bigger than a windmill. She had tried to break community trust, warp the truth, and bully her way through power. And it had blown up in her face spectacularly. Over the next week, the fallout was delicious. Karen stopped attending HOA meetings. A special vote was scheduled to formally remove her from the board. Her name disappeared from the HOA website. Carl's drone company shut down their fake airspace compliance division. And me? I got a check that covered everything down to the penny. I ordered the replacement blade immediately. The manufacturer, sympathetic to my situation, offered me a discount and even etched a custom label near the hub that read Karen's contribution. I didn't ask for it. They just thought it was funny. The final piece of the puzzle arrived 2 days later. A letter from the city, congratulating me on my legal win and offering a speaking slot at a community sustainability event next month. Apparently, my case had become a small symbol of standing up to nonsense with facts, law, and a little bit of patience. I accepted. Not because I wanted attention, but because the story deserved to be told. How one person's pettiness tried to destroy progress, and how the truth, when properly documented and persistently defended, spun harder than any blade she could break. As for Karen, she went quiet. Her yard signs disappeared. The megaphone was never seen again. I heard she put her house up for sale but pulled the listing after a few lowball offers. Maybe she was planning her next crusade in another zip code. Maybe she finally learned what happens when you poke the wrong turbine. Either way, I didn't care. The windmill was fixed. The system was running better than ever, and the air had never felt cleaner. The new turbine blade arrived on a bright Tuesday morning, crated and gleaming like some kind of futuristic sculpture. The delivery crew carefully hoisted it into place, and within a few hours, the windmill stood whole again, taller, stronger, and somehow prouder than before. It spun with quiet precision, the gentle hum returning like a heartbeat to the land. Watching it turn again filled me with a strange kind of peace. Not just because the machine was back in action, but because everything it symbolized had survived. Clean energy. Logic over lunacy. Standing your ground without stooping to pettiness. Karen had tried everything to grind it to a halt, but the wind never stopped blowing, and now it carried a lesson with it every time the blades turned. The neighborhood was different now too. There was a new quiet in the air, and for once it wasn't tense. It was peaceful. People smiled more. A few even stopped me during walks just to say they were glad someone stood up to the madness. It turned out I wasn't the only one Karen had tormented. She'd fined one neighbor for planting a fig tree, another for painting their mailbox blue. Her reign of passive-aggressive terror had gone on for years, but no one had pushed back hard enough until now. My win became a kind of community reset. Her name wasn't spoken much anymore, and when it was, it came with an eye roll or a smirk. The HOA board quietly replaced her with a retired teacher named Elsie, who brought a pot of muffins to the first meeting and said her only goal was to keep people from fighting over bushes. The entire room applauded. Meanwhile, Carl disappeared entirely. His truck stopped showing up around the neighborhood. The Aero Integrity website went down. I heard from one of the board members that he tried to pitch a new drone-based home security service to another HOA across town, but they'd already read about the court case and told him they weren't interested in airborne lawsuits. I didn't feel bad. He'd tried to turn my property into his business playground and almost got away with it. But the thing about spinning lies is, eventually they wrap right back around and slap you in the face. With the settlement money, I went beyond just replacing the blade. I reinvested in a full upgrade. The new model had adaptive rotation sensors, quieter motorization, and even a weather adjustment feature that let me optimize energy storage before storms. I expanded my battery bank and added a new inverter, which meant I could now provide backup power for both the animal shelter and the local community center. When I posted about it on the neighborhood app, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Someone even suggested we start a microgrid initiative for the block. It was surreal to think that the same windmill that Karen had called a dangerous monstrosity was now the centerpiece of a community energy project. As the days went on, I began moving forward, but not without leaving a little reminder. The broken blade, charred, cracked, and forever marked by Karen's drone, was cleaned, mounted on a wooden stand, and placed near my driveway. Above it, I hung a simple metal plaque that read, Karen's contribution, People walking by would stop, stare, and then chuckle. It wasn't revenge. It was history. A monument to what happens when ego meets reality at high speed. A few weeks after the court ruling, something happened that caught me completely off guard. I was in my garage tweaking a solar junction box when a car pulled up quietly at the curb. I looked over and saw Karen stepping out. She wasn't wearing her sun hat or heels. No clipboard, no megaphone, no stacks of flyers. Just jeans, a loose sweater, and a plastic grocery bag in one hand. She walked up slowly, her eyes avoiding mine, and stopped just short of the driveway. I stood there in silence, waiting to see what she wanted. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she looked up, her expression tired, not defiant. She said, "I'm not here to fight." I didn't respond, just let the quiet speak for itself. She held out the bag slightly. "It's a peace offering," she said, awkwardly. "Lemon pound cake. I didn't bake it. Just figured. I don't know. You might like cake." It was such an absurd moment that I almost laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded once and took the bag. Not as a truce, not as forgiveness. Just as the final act in a play that had run far too long. Karen didn't say anything else. She turned around and got back into her car. Drove off without another word. I didn't see her again after that. A week later, her house went on the market for real this time. A couple from out of state bought it within days. When she left, it felt like the clouds finally cleared. No more drama. No more nonsense. Just neighbors getting back to their lives. I focused on my projects. Expanded the garden. Built a wind-powered water pump for the community plot. Even hosted a weekend tech talk for some kids in the area. We called it Power from the Wind, and they loved it. One of them asked if the windmill could shoot lasers. I told him not yet, but if Karen ever moved back, we'd talk upgrades. And the windmill? It kept spinning. Day in, day out. Quietly, gracefully, and completely unmoved by human drama. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the fight. Not just against Karen, but against the absurdity, the bureaucracy, and the attempt to undermine something that was built with care, purpose, and a little bit of hope. It stood tall not just as a piece of engineering, but as a symbol of what can happen when you refuse to back down. The world is full of people like Karen. People who think they can bend reality around their opinions, who use rules like weapons and confusion like camouflage. But sometimes, all it takes is one good gust of truth to blow the nonsense away. I didn't win because I was the loudest. I won because I had the facts, the patience, and just enough stubbornness to let the storm pass. So now, when the wind kicks up and that turbine starts to turn, I smile. Not because I beat Karen, but because I didn't let her beat me.